And good morning, everybody, to this webinar. I'm John, joined by Jack. So I'm John Foulkes, joined by Jack Lewis. We are looking today to cover modern IT and code management of IT infrastructure using a combination of System Center and Intune. In terms of our roles, my role is focused on commercial and licensing. Jack is more focused from a technical perspective. He's a senior technical architect within our Microsoft technical and pre-sales division, and we'll be running through those areas. I'm going to be deferring quite a bit to Jack here in terms of his technical expertise. Jack, quick hello from you, if you would.
Yep. Good morning, John. Good morning, everybody.
Great stuff. So, modern IT and co-management. Let's kick things off. So, just going through the deck. So, firstly, classic IT and modern IT, and how those things morph and change, and how we move to modern IT infrastructure management. I suppose that's the setting here, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, I think we've covered this concept on some of the previous webinars, but I think it's important just to go over it very quickly again. These are Microsoft terminologies, by the way. So classic IT is essentially a concept that is assigned to the way that we have delivered compute services and apps to our end users over the past 15 years in IT, with modern IT being the new way of approaching that to support the way that users want to work now and the way businesses want to empower their users to work. And they are very different approaches. If you look at classic IT from a Windows perspective, typically in the classic IT world, we would provide end users with a corporate-owned device. We would take it out of the box, we would re-image it, we would join it to the on-premises domain, we'd join it to System Center Configuration Manager or enroll it into System Center Configuration Manager, and we'd use a combination of group policy and System Center Configuration Manager to micromanage that device and install complex applications. And that's great, that's the way that we've always worked, and it's very appropriate for certainly certain user profiles even today, certainly a suitable way of delivering IT services. But Microsoft have developed a modern IT approach now that perhaps aligns better with end users who perhaps want to work from their own device or from multiple devices and want to be productive when they are outside the office. So in the modern IT world, from a Windows perspective, just as a very quick overview, typically we would perform an Azure AD join on that device rather than joining it to the on-premises version of Active Directory, so that single sign-on is granted from anywhere. We would target policies at users and use mobile device management solutions to configure the device, which is certainly not as fully featured as using group policy or System Center Configuration Manager. And I always describe it as what you kind of gain in efficiencies by using the modern IT approach. You kind of do losing control, so there are sacrifices. But if you can certainly operate within those limitations, modern IT is a very desirable place to be, because it means that your end users are empowered to do the jobs regardless of their location and regardless of the device owner. And up until recently, if we look at the middle there where it says classic IT versus modern IT, it was very much a vertical split. So we do a lot of user profiling exercises with organizations where we would decide how that end user wants to work and which methodology would be the most appropriate way to support them. So we would assign perhaps classic IT to an end user who is very static and requires complex applications, or we would use modern IT methodologies for an end user that perhaps wants to work from trains and isn't in the office very often and wants to work from their own device. It's very much a vertical split. You either got one or the other, never a mixture of both, until recently when Microsoft announced core management. If you just want to skip to the next slide there, please, John.
Certainly, Jack. Yeah, let's just move that on.
Yeah, which brings together essentially what core management is. It's the amalgamation of the two together where it is most appropriate. So if we had a vertical split previously where you decided wholeheartedly whether somebody was classic IT managed or modern IT managed, with core management you now have the ability to actually break that down on a function by function basis. So it's a horizontal split. And as we move through the capabilities and the concepts and the implementation steps that are included in this presentation, it'll become clear how that is approached and what the capabilities are in terms of being able to, for example, still install complex applications onto a device via Configuration Manager from anywhere, regardless of the location of the device, but gain efficiencies by perhaps managing the updates via Intune and promoting self-service via Office 365. So, yeah, anything else to add there, John, before we move into prereqs and implementation steps?
I think you've covered it very eloquently there, Jack. So yeah, nothing to add.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
So we've got quite a lot of content to cover here, guys, and it is relatively technical. And the first, certainly the next 10 slides are relatively dry. So I do apologise in advance, but we've created these slides in the presentation so that we can provide them to customers. And it gives them some steps to follow, so they know exactly what tasks they need to do to get their estate into a core management ready state and what order they should perform them in. So we'll walk through those, and as Cherie said before we kicked off, this presentation is going to be available on YouTube as well if you do want to watch it back. But let's just talk about domain joined devices. So this is where I think the documentation falls down a little bit that has been provided out on the web at the moment. There's very much a split between how you core manage ready a domain joined device versus an Azure AD joined device. So if you do currently have that vertical split where you've got perhaps 10% of your user estate that's modern IT managed versus the 90% that's classic IT managed, there are two different approaches that you will need to take. But if we just look at what you need to have in place in order to support on-premises domain join machines, first of all, you will need to run the 1709 feature update of Windows 10 or later. 1709 is when the core management capabilities were introduced into Windows 10, and this is absolutely not available for anything earlier than that. So Windows 7 devices do not support core management, 8, 8.1, or Mac OS. It is a 1709 or later feature within Windows 10. From an Active Directory perspective, in terms of getting your estate into a Windows 10 core management ready state, you will need to ensure that you've got hybrid domain join configured, which we will cover a little bit later because the implementation steps that are associated with that can be relatively complex if you are using ADFS. And Microsoft have focused their efforts around simplifying how to do that, but there are still some things to be aware of. But that is something that you will need to have in place before you turn on core management. In terms of System Center Configuration Manager, you will need Config Manager current branch, 1710 or later. And if you move through to later editions of Config Manager current branch, you get further capabilities. And just to touch on the licensing aspect here, John, correct me if I'm wrong, current branch does require software assurance on the licensing. So correct. Typically an effective way to purchase that would be via Enterprise Mobility and Security. Are there any other ways that customers can get that if they haven't got software assurance on their licensing?
So yeah, I guess again this looks at from a licensing perspective, the traditional versus the modern as well. There's a reflective there as well. So within the traditional CAL suites, the core CAL suite, the enterprise CAL suite, then the likes of the SCCM client licensing is there as well. But more and more we see the move to EM&S or M365, E3 or indeed E5, where and specifically it is the EM&S layer there, the enterprise mobility and security layer within the suite that you've got the Windows Server CAL on subscription and the SCCM client license as well as other Azure services, of course, as we've covered in previous webinars. But absolutely, this is a client side licensing requirement. EM&S absolutely covers that in terms of what we're talking about here on this slide.
Yeah, which moves nicely on to kind of the next point down, which talks about enterprise mobility and security. Now, this is exclusive to Windows 10, 1709 or later, System Center Configuration Manager, current branch, 1710 or later, and Intune. Unfortunately, if organizations are using System Center Configuration Manager for classic IT and say AirWatch for an MDM for the modern IT, core management doesn't work. This is exclusively Intune, Config Manager, and Windows 10. And it's the capabilities that have been required for a little while, in my opinion. So it's nice that they are there. But if you are using AirWatch, unfortunately, core management is not going to be available for you or any other MDM provider other than Intune. And as we touch on EM&S there, if you've got EM&S, or enterprise ability and security E3, you do get the Intune licensing. But as an absolute bare minimum to support this, you will need software assurance on Config Manager and Intune. EM&S provides you with a whole host of other services as well, alongside those two licensings. And from a client perspective, in order to enable core management capabilities, you will need to make sure that you are pushing down the latest client. So when you do the upgrade to System Center current branch through the various feature updates that are available there, you need to ensure that you're pushing out that client as well, or you won't be able to manage core management. And also, because we are essentially bringing the worlds of classic IT and modern IT together here, your device needs to be hybrid AD joined, which means it's joined to the on-premises Active Directory and then written to the Azure version of Active Directory. So it's essentially joined to both. Also, you need to be enrolled in Config Manager and enrolled in Intune. So in order to do that, there's kind of two ways you can do it. You can either target a MDM policy, group policy to force MDM enrollment, or you can configure it via Config Manager client settings. So those are the minimum requirements for domain joined machines. If we just move through to the next, and that's on-premises domain joined machines, guys, just to kind of ensure that we're on the same track here. In terms of the capabilities that enables, because those steps are relatively straightforward compared to the other steps that we'll need to undertake to enable it for Azure AD joined devices. That essentially enables Intune-only features for those on-premises domain joined devices that are now set up for core management. So you can push selective wipes and full wipes at the devices, which is a really nice place to be. Unfortunately, you can't do that with Config Manager out of the box. But when you core manage a device, Intune has that capability, so it's able to push that down. In terms of the core management workloads that you can move, this is the function by function basis stuff that we referenced earlier. If you are running the minimum supported version of Config Manager, you will be able to migrate compliance management, resource access policies, which is essentially VPNs, Wi-Fi profiles, certificates, and Windows update policies. So you can say, rather than managing Windows updates through Config Manager, we want to use Windows Update for Business policies via Intune. You can do that with the minimum supported version. If you are running the 18.03 version of Config Manager, you can also migrate endpoint protection to the cloud as well. And this is performed via a number of sliders that you move across. So when you enable core management, and we've got some screenshots of this a little bit later on, all of your roles will be delivered from Config Manager. So all of those functions, when you first enable it, will essentially, by default, still be delivered via Config Manager. You will then need to open up the core management settings. And if you want to deliver updates via Intune, you move the slider across to say, right, we're now ready for either our pilot devices or all of our devices that are eligible for core management to get those updates via Intune rather than via Config Manager. And it's the same for all of the workloads. And if anybody here runs the technical preview version of Config Manager, the latest technical preview version, which is 18.05, also includes the ability to migrate configuration management. And just a quick note on that, although it is still in technical preview, one of the really neat things you can do here is, even if you migrate Configuration Manager to Intune, you can still override that on a setting-by-setting basis, because one of the concepts with MDM management is you can only manage a limited set of configuration settings that Microsoft have defined as in scope for MDM. Similar to an iOS device or an Android device, the operating system manufacturers essentially dictate what you can and cannot do with MDMs, whereas with Config Manager, we can micromanage registry settings to whatever we want them to be. You do not lose that functionality, fortunately, even if you migrate the configuration management aspect to Intune, you can still override it on a setting-by-setting basis, and I think that's really cool. But of course, that's not in the production version of Config Manager or the version that you will be using in your production environments, but it is available in technical preview at the moment. So that is the kind of the bare minimum for core management. Unfortunately, that doesn't cover or allow you to do core management for those MDM enrolled devices that are Azure AD joined at the moment, or the workplace joined devices. There are additional steps that you need to undertake. So we just move through to the next slide, John. For Azure, I'm going to refer to these as Azure AD joined for the purpose of the rest of the presentation. But essentially, to enable the functionality for those Azure AD joined devices, on top of those original requirements, the additional requirements that you need to perform in order to get it into a core management ready state for those devices is you need to configure cloud management from Config Manager, which is a relatively straightforward task. That then enables the Azure AD user discovery task within Config Manager. There are a couple of gotchas there which we'll talk about in the troubleshooting section at the end that I always make customers aware of, but that's a relatively straightforward task. But you will also need to configure Cloud Management Gateway, which requires an Azure presence and also requires PKI authentication into Config Manager. You would also ideally want to provision a cloud distribution point as well, because that's going to allow you to push software to devices when they are outside of the network using the most efficient methodology. Without the cloud distribution point, you essentially can end up in a situation where you've got devices outside the network that can receive policy, but can't receive software from Config Manager or packages. So although it's listed as an optional requirement, it really does need to be performed. And then just focusing very quickly on Cloud Management Gateway here, guys. This is an Azure subscription role. And because it utilizes what's known as a classic cloud service, if you purchase Azure via CSP at the moment, you unfortunately will not be able to provision the role. So you will need to use a methodology, perhaps another subscription alongside your CSP subscription, to enable access to those classic cloud services. And from a cost perspective, it essentially provisions an A2 V2 virtual machine. So that should allow you to do some sort of cost analysis work up front before you actually commit to deploying this role. In terms of PKI authentication into Config Manager, this is a relatively complex task. It of course requires a PKI implementation internally so that you can deploy client authentication certificates to your workstations and also server authentication certificates to your servers. And when that is actually implemented, that's an on-premises requirement, by the way, so you need to install it into your on-premises domain. You would also then need to configure HTTPS for the management points, which is a role within Config Manager that essentially distributes policies, and also the software update points if you want to be able to manage updates via Config Manager for those Azure AD joined devices. One thing to keep in mind here as well is at the time of release, Cloud Management Gateway and Cloud Distribution Point didn't support the Azure Resource Manager templates for deployment, so you had to use management certificates and go via the classic service deployment models. That is now not the case with 1803 Config Manager for Cloud Management Gateway, and for Cloud Distribution Point in the latest version of the technical preview, you will be able to deploy those using ARM templates as well. And the recommendation from Microsoft is if you guys have already got Cloud Distribution Points and Cloud Management Gateways, migrate them to the ARM model. So you need to essentially replace them and then delete the old one. So that's just something to keep in mind there as well, that there's a little bit of flux there where you can essentially deploy the role using two different methodologies. But the recommendation is to use the ARM templates. John, can we move on, if possible, please?
Yeah.
So those are the additional requirements. If we look at the capabilities that provides you with by performing those additional requirements, it essentially gives you the same functionality for those Azure AD joined devices. And at that point, you've then got true coexistence and the bridge between the two from both sides. It's not a one-way bridge at that point, where your domain joined devices only get the ability to also gain access to the modern IT efficiencies and benefits associated with that. You can kind of go both ways. The primary reasons for doing that are related to complex software deployments or micromanagement of device configuration, as we've touched on earlier in the presentation and certainly in previous webinars that we've done. Intune and the MDM approach is very desirable, but sometimes it physically just isn't possible to actually take that approach wholeheartedly due to the fact that it's somewhat limited in its ability to do those complex app installs and that micromanagement of the device configuration. So if you've got the bridge going both ways, and it's a two-way street, you can essentially reap the benefits of both approaches, which is great, because if you use services like Windows Autopilot, currently that can only be used to do an Azure AD join. if you walk through the story of that doing an Azure AD join, you gaining the efficiencies of delivering devices directly to end users without IT having to touch the device, no need to re-image the device. They're somewhat forced to do the Azure AD join. Intune then kicks in, does the MDM bits, installs the config manager agent, and essentially you've got the ability to then do the complex app installs for those devices. So that, as I've touched on there, that the capabilities are the same, provided you've done those additional requirements for both sides of the bridge.
Yeah.
And if we can just move on,
Good. Yeah.
please, John. So the next slides, once we've moved on from prereqs, requirements and capabilities, talks about the logical steps to actually get this implemented. And absolutely, organizations will be able to skip some of these steps, because a lot of organizations that we speak to are already running Configuration Manager current branch, and they're running the latest version, or the latest feature update, sorry. If you guys are doing that, you can skip the first step. If not, it's an exercise that you'll need to go through. So you'll need to either upgrade your existing Configuration Manager or implement a new Configuration Manager and use that to actually manage your device estate moving forward. If you are going to upgrade your existing config manager, just keep in mind that the later versions of System Center Configuration Manager current branch do not, you can't install them onto a primary site server that's running 2008 R2 or earlier. You have to move to 2012 or later. But an in-place upgrade is supported. So you can do an in-place upgrade of the operating system. I'm not sure whether we recommend that methodology, but if you are in that scenario, get in touch with us and we'll have a chat with you and we'll discuss options that you've got available to you in order to actually perform that migration or the the brand new implementation, if that's more appropriate. In terms of Windows 10, if you are running older feature updates than 1709 or 1803, you're going to need to get those devices upgraded. The great thing is, if you've done System Center Configuration Manager as the first step, you've then got a tool to actually push those feature updates out to the Windows 10 devices in your organization, and we'd certainly recommend in-place upgrade task sequences for larger organizations. Smaller organizations can potentially, if they've not got massively complex software, and they've got, they're relatively confident that the feature update won't cause them any issues, feel free to just use the built-in servicing models, which is certainly simpler than an in-place upgrade task sequence. In terms of making sure that those on-premises devices are written to Azure AD, there are a number of steps that organizations will potentially need to go through here, but there are other benefits associated with this than just being able to do core management. You also get things like single sign-on into the store. So in the past, this was a bit of a headache, really, particularly if you had ADFS to authenticate into Azure AD and Office 365. You would have to implement claims rules to write information about your devices, the domain join devices, to Azure AD. For password hash sync and pass-through authentication, the steps are certainly simpler. You simply use the later versions of Azure AD Connect to synchronize organizational units where your computers reside. But if you do have ADFS and you are missing the claims rules that are referenced in the article here that we've dropped into the presentation, the later versions of Azure AD Connect can actually create those claims rules for you, and they will make your life a lot easier rather than actually trying to follow the guidance and doing it yourself. So I'd certainly recommend that approach. But if any customers are struggling with that, let us know, and we're more than happy to assist. In terms of MDM authority, this is a really interesting one, actually. Everyone who has had Intune for the last 2 years and Config Manager will know that there is a deployment where you can essentially do something called hybrid MDM, where you manage Intune from Config Manager, the settings within Intune. Microsoft recommended this approach right until probably about 6 or 7 months ago, where the dream was kind of sold that you got a single pane of glass to manage both Config Manager and Intune. The reality was that essentially Config Manager didn't really get updated as fast as Intune, so new features would come out within Intune and you wouldn't be able to manage them if you did hybrid MDM via Config Manager. And also the Config Manager interface is certainly not as nice to operate as Intune, so that was another issue there. Core management, if you are in that hybrid MDM model, is not supported. So you will need to actually migrate away from that. Now, interestingly, it used to be that when you made that decision in the Intune world, if you wanted to change your MDM authority, i.e. if you picked config manager and then realized, oh, actually, I want to manage it through Intune, you had to essentially get Microsoft to remove your Intune tenant, re-provision you a new tenant, and then re-enroll all of your devices. Fortunately, there is a migration methodology available now, and we've put the guidance there. It's not massively complex. There are a number of steps that you'll need to jump, that's kind of hoops that you'll need to jump through to get there. But if you are operating in that hybrid MDM mode at the moment, just follow the guide, and if you need any guidance, again, just feel free to get in touch with us. I'm more than happy to assist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So just to reiterate that as well, John, sorry.
Yeah.
It requires Intune as the MDM authority. Hybrid MDM isn't supported there. So next set of logical steps, and this is assuming that you want to do both sides of the bridge, not just the domain join devices. So we've thrown all of the logical steps in here because I think, certainly it's my opinion, that core management really should support both sides rather than just the one side. It's a viable approach if you want to do one side, but you will be limited on those Azure AD join devices as to what you can do from a core management perspective. Moving through to the next steps, you will then need to implement cloud management, which is a relatively simple task. They've made life quite easy for IT administrators here. So when you're in the later versions of Config Manager, you essentially expand out from administration, cloud services, and then you will provision the cloud management, which is the connector to Azure AD from Config Manager. There are two methodologies for doing that. There's an import methodology, which I don't think I'd recommend. It requires you to provision the apps inside Azure AD yourselves, or you can provide credentials to Config Manager and tell it to go and create those app registrations for you. One thing to keep in mind here, and we've seen a lot of customers have problems with this, if those Azure AD user sync tasks are not functional after you have created those, it's because you need to go into the Azure portal and actually explicitly grant it permissions that it's requested. There is a screenshot later that shows you how to do that, because it is a step that customers do tend to miss out, and certainly I missed it out in the early days as well. It's not massively clear in the documentation that you physically need to go and log into the Azure AD portal to enable that. So that's just something to watch out for there. But once that's functional, you can then move on to the later steps, which is going to be implementing PKI authentication for Config Manager. We touched on this briefly. What I'd recommend is organizations, if they already have a PKI implementation, the guidance article that we've listed there should be relatively simple to follow. There will need to be some changes that you need to make to your Config Manager environment, of course, to tell it to use HTTPS rather than HTTP, and to use the PKI certificates for client authentication. But essentially the steps are utilize the web server and the workstation authentication certificate templates that are built in, take duplicates of them, and then deploy server authentication certificates to Config Manager site systems, client authentication certificates to distribution points and also to your clients. And then there is a methodology that you need to go through to actually get certificates so that you can use them for the cloud management gateway and cloud distribution point. Essentially, you just request the certificates from the Config Manager server, make sure that the private key is exportable, and then export the certificates out. And then when you are creating the cloud management gateway role, which is the next step, you reference those certificates that you have requested. In terms of cloud management gateway, which is, of course is the next step that I've just mentioned, if you are using ARM, you simply log into Config Manager. All of this is done from Config Manager, by the way. You don't log into the Azure portal to create the classic cloud service. Open up Config Manager, go to Cloud Services, which is under administration, find Cloud Management Gateway. If you are using ARM, you will simply authenticate using Azure AD credentials, and that's the recommended approach. If, for whatever reason, you don't want to use that or it's not suitable, you've still got the ability to use the classic management approach, which requires you to upload a management certificate to Azure and then use that for authentication purposes. Again, it's not massively complex to do that, but it's not the recommended approach by Microsoft. And after you've done that, another step that we've seen customers skip and have issues with in the past, you need to make sure that you install the Cloud Management Gateway connection point site system. It's a manual task for some reason. It doesn't do it automatically, but you do need to do that. And these take about 5 to 10 minutes to provision, maybe 15 minutes if Azure is having a bad day. But you can actually watch the progress, which is really good as well. And keep in mind, obviously, you're going to be charged for these roles. Once that's implemented and you've got the certificates in place, that is when we'd actually recommend that you turn on HTTPS for the management points and the software update points. And also there's a tick box that says allow clients to communicate via the cloud management gateway with these roles. You also need to tick that. And then moving through to the next steps. I'm sorry guys, I know that these are dry in terms of PowerPoint slides, but essentially you've got the cloud distribution point there. It's a similar sort of process to cloud management gateway. ARM, authenticated via your Azure AD credentials. If you're using classic service, then it's management certs to actually provision the role, and it's all done from config manager again. Make sure you drop that cloud distribution point into either the default boundary group or a defined boundary group, or clients won't be able to access it. But the great thing about config manager is the logs are very verbose, so if you are seeing that issue, it will be very apparent to you very early on. In terms of device registration, you need to make sure that Azure AD is actually configured to support this as well. So there are a couple of steps that you'll need to go through if you've changed the default settings to allow end users to register devices in Azure. And also, if you're doing Windows Hello for Business in a hybrid integration or a hybrid model, that's another requirement for Windows Hello for Business, as is the hybrid AD steps as well. So a lot of these steps are the same. They're also the same steps if you want to manage the store effectively using private store on domain joined devices in order to get single sign-on. So there's a good chance that organizations, if they are a certain way down the road from a Windows 10 perspective into that journey, will actually have a number of these steps already in place, which is quite refreshing. In terms of core management, there was a marketing campaign recently, a couple of blogs that Microsoft have released called Just 4 Clicks, which was the advertisement for getting customers to actually enable core management. And the message was that it just takes 4 clicks to enable core management. Well, that's perhaps true if you've got the hybrid AD already in place, the hybrid AD integrations, and your devices are being written to Azure AD, and you only want to manage domain joined devices. Then it's only 4 clicks. If not, you've obviously seen with the content that we've covered today, there are more than 4 clicks that you need to go through to enable the Azure AD joined devices and to actually get your infrastructure into a core management ready state. But some of you guys might have seen the blog article and the videos that they've produced called Just 4 Clicks. I just wanted to reference that. And also, when you do enable core management, which is the Just 4 Clicks thing, where you go into the config manager console and you right-click core management, you say enable core management, that is where you'll see the sliders and where you can define a pilot group. We would always recommend you create a device collection that contains a group of pilot devices for you to test the functionality of core management before you decide to deploy it to your entire estate. So that's just something to keep in mind there. Additionally, you're also going to need to target a policy to enroll the Windows 10 devices in MDM. This can actually be done through client management. I prefer to do it by group policy, but those are the methodologies that are available for you, and that goes back to the device registration piece that we've enabled in the Azure AD portal. If we talk about config manager client settings, you also need to enable support for cloud management gateway and user policy refresh for internet connected clients. So that's just something to keep in mind there. It could well be that you've got user policy refresh enabled. I don't think it's enabled by the default settings, so it might be that you just need to go in there and do that. But it's just something to keep in mind that if you don't have that enabled, your Azure AD joined devices won't have the ability to communicate via the cloud management gateway, and your on-premises domain joined devices won't either when they're outside the network. So yeah, moving on to the final setup and configuration steps page, and then we can get out of the dry slides, John. Okay. Once we've got this, before you move the sliders across, you need to make sure Intune is configured correctly to support the workloads. So if you're going to move your updates from Config Manager to Intune, make sure you've defined the Windows Update for Business policies in Intune and targeted them at the users or the devices. If you don't do that, when you move the slider across, they're not going to get any policies applied to them. So that's an important concept. Also, when you get to this point, you then want to import the Config Manager client into Intune so that the Azure AD joined devices get the Config Manager client installed, and they are then able to enroll themselves into Config Manager and get the core management capabilities. Once you've got all of this, that's when you can start moving the sliders across, which is a really nice experience, because that's when you start seeing actually the capabilities and the functionality and the benefits of this. In terms of monitoring the results, which we'll talk about in the troubleshooting section later, when you enable core management, it actually applies a configuration baseline. So it's very easy to actually log on to a client, go to control panel, open configuration manager, and just see whether it's compliant with those policies. If it isn't, you can check the logs out, of which we've referenced some useful logs later on, or there is some really brilliant monitoring capabilities that actually are actionable as well. So if your devices are struggling to auto-enroll, you can click on it and it'll tell you which ones are, and they update relatively quickly as well. Obviously, it depends on your client settings, how often your devices talk back, but the monitoring portal is pretty good, to be fair. Just gives you those easy insights. And those are the end of the implementation steps. There are obviously a lot there. So this is why we've created the slides in the way that they are. And also there are additional roles that you may need to provision alongside Azure. But if we just move through to the next set of slides, John, this just shows the experience from a user perspective, an admin perspective. So we've got a couple of slides here. Essentially, this just shows you where to look to see whether core management is enabled on your clients. So on the very left-hand side, we're looking at the configuration manager properties for a endpoint that is enrolled that has core management enabled, as you can see, and is using PKI for authentication. The second one, which is the middle picture, shows the compliance settings and the fact that the device is compliant. Also, when you do MDM enrollment on a domain joined device, if you go to settings, click accounts, click access work or school, and you click on the AD domain, you'll see an info tab. And when you click on info, it will tell you which settings are managed via MDM. So it will physically tell you which policies are being applied as a result of you moving those sliders across, which is excellent. So that's from a client perspective. We just
yeah. Good to have the visuals here, isn't it?
Yeah, we definitely needed some, John.
Brings it to life a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, in terms of actually looking at this from an admin perspective, when you've got devices enrolled, you will see in Intune, they will be listed as MDM and config manager agent enrolled. And you will also be able to tell the difference between a hybrid domain joined device and an Azure AD joined device that's written back. So that's just something to keep in mind there and something to look out for. We have seen issues where tenants, when they first get provisioned, there's kind of inconsistencies between whether it's listing the MDM as the authority or config manager as the authority. Those tend to subside over time, but if you are struggling with those, we'd recommend that you just log a ticket with Microsoft, and they're doing a really good job of actually actioning those issues. If we just move on, sorry, John.
Oh, fine.
This is the monitoring tab that I spoke about that is actionable. So if you do have any red bits in here, so anything that's flashing warning signs, you can click on it and it'll tell you exactly which devices are struggling. Again, that's only going to be available on the later versions of Config Manager, of course. And then we've got one more experience slide, and then we're on to troubleshooting. Yeah, these are the sliders, guys. So essentially, when you've got yourself into that core management ready state, these are the sliders that you can move across to easily at that point, migrate workloads to the cloud. And obviously, if you move it into the middle, that's when only the pilot devices that are defined in the staging section would receive the core management policies, or the policies from Intune, or the workloads from Intune, sorry.
Yeah. And that staging section is available on that last tab there, isn't that, to define which
which
absolutely devices those are. Yeah,
absolutely. It's simply the only setting that's under that tab, John. And also under enablement, that is where you go to check whether you are in a ready state for core management of Azure AD joined devices. So unless you've done all the cloud management gateway and the PKI authentication and the various other steps that we've discussed, you will simply see a warning message that says you need to perform the readiness tasks in order to manage Azure AD joined devices in a core management state. So that's a quick place you can go to actually check that out. Yeah. I realise we're running out of time, but we'll get into the last slides now, guys, I promise. In terms of troubleshooting, this is the grant permissions that we referenced earlier. If you use cloud management, and you tell Configuration Manager to create the apps on your behalf, you still have to log into the Azure portal, go to app registrations, and click grant permissions, or it simply won't work. And that takes about an hour, typically. So don't expect it once you've granted permissions to work straight away. Give it an hour, come back, run the full discovery, and you'll be good to go. And finally, I think this is the final slide, we may have one more. These are the logs and the various commands that I use on a regular basis to ascertain whether it's in a healthy state within core management or an unhealthy state. The top one is very useful, dsreg command. That will essentially give you information around whether your device has been successfully written to Azure AD, whether you've been granted the necessary authentication tokens. Log files, I'll let you guys kind of consume that in your own time, but there are client authentication logs that you can look at to give you some insights, and some config manager logs, and we all know that config manager is very verbose and brilliant at logging, so those are very useful. And also the event viewer stuff, so these are the Crimson logs or the application and servicing logs. These will give you deep insights into any issues that you are having, and also success and failure messages. So go and check those out if you're having issues with core management. And finally, this is another one that's very useful. When you target that MDM enrollment policy at your devices, if they are not MDM enrolling, come into log into task schedule on the device, look at enterprise management by expanding out I think it's Windows, and then you go to enterprise management. If you don't have this folder structure underneath enterprise management, it is not doing the MDM enroll, and it will give you an error message, and hopefully that'll point you guys in the right direction.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a close.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks, John.
And great stuff. So, I appreciate we're just over time, only by a couple of minutes. So, thank you for hanging on. If there are any questions, we can take questions in the question and answer dialog box quickly now. But if not, we can hang on for a second. But if not, happy to call it a day. If there are any specific questions off the back of this, absolutely do get in touch. Normal channels via your Softcat account manager. Myself, Jack, and the wider teams are happy to pick these up and respond via your account manager.